Welcome, everybody. We'll be getting started soon. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been watching the counter on people joining us, and it looks like it's sort of steadied at 30. It's really great to have everybody here today. My name is Christy Hedman, and I'm director of the Washington Defender Association, and I'm very pleased to have you join us. This talk is on today's transit talk is on repealing Washington's jaywalking laws. It's hosted by Transportation Choices Coalition, a policy and advocacy organization in Washington State, working to bring people more and better transportation options that are healthy, sustainable, and accessible. We'd like to make a land acknowledgement now. Transportation Choices Coalition would like to take a moment and acknowledge that while we are gathering today virtually, our panel is joining us from unceded lands in the Pacific Northwest. We are calling in from the tribal land of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish, Spokane, and Mississauga people. We are dropping a resource in the chat and invite you to learn about the land you are on, and we welcome you to acknowledge it in the chat itself. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom, like the Duwamish, are still fighting for federal recognition. Mobility for all cannot be achieved without recognizing those who first navigated these spaces. As we work towards building a more accessible world, let us honor the physical spaces we occupy and the Native communities, past, present, and future, who live and thrive here. A few housekeeping tasks or items to inform you. We just wanted to point out some things about our current virtual space. We've enabled captions for this talk. So if you'd like to show or the subtitles, you may do so by using the options that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen under live transcript. We've enabled the chat feature to make this webinar more interactive. So please use the chat to ask questions and expand on discussion topics. And of course, be respectful to panelists and each other. Questions can also be submitted directly to panelists. We will have staff sorting through all our questions, and we will answer as many of them as we can throughout the discussion. The whole talk will be recorded, and a link will be emailed to you once it is available. Today, we will be discussing jaywalking laws here in Washington and across the country and why they are harmful. On a side note, I wanted to acknowledge what the trauma that the country has been going through now relating to the Tyree Nichols beating and death. And even though this is not exactly what this particular law change would address, it addresses underlying police accountability and also trying to reduce the number of interactions that people who may or may not be committing infractions are subject to police interactions. So we wanted to also acknowledge that there are a lot of police accountability bills that are under review this year, and we'll be sharing that information more broadly with the coalition if people want to get involved in those efforts. But today we're discussing the jaywalking laws and the building momentum across the country to repeal those laws. California, Virginia, Nevada, and Kansas City have all passed laws decriminalizing jaywalking, and the Denver City Council is currently considering a bill to do the same. Locally, the Free to Walk Washington campaign is pushing the state to repeal jaywalking laws and related pedestrian offenses this legislative session. Senator Rebecca Saldana is championing this issue with Senate Bill 5383, and Representative Alvarado is leading the House effort with House Bill 1428. We are joined today by three incredible advocates that will help us dive into this issue. I'm really so pleased to introduce them. Please welcome Anwar Peace. He's a Spokane-based police accountability activist. Anwar also sits on the Spokane Human Rights Commission. Ethan Campbell is a Seattle-based researcher and safe streets advocate. Ethan also organizes with Central Seattle Greenways and Who Streets, Our Streets. And last but not least is Angie Schmidt. She's a national advocate for safe streets. She's a writer with Streets Blog USA and author of Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. I'd like to invite each of our panelists to quickly introduce themselves now. We'll start with Anwar, then Ethan, then Angie.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Anwar Peace, and I am a 22-year police accountability expert. I'm really grateful to be on this panel and working on repealing this legislation, mainly because I've had personal experience with jaywalking law. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, it's great to see you all on this panel. Thank you, Christy, for the intro. Ethan Campbell, I'm joining from Seattle. I work on bike and ped safe streets advocacy with the Seattle Neighborhood Greenways Coalition, specifically Central Seattle Greenways. I'm also part of Who Streets, Our Streets. It's an all BIPOC work group looking at the role of policing in Seattle's transportation system. And I'm here because I've been working with TCC on this campaign and research to help us better understand how jaywalking has been enforced across Washington state, some of which I'm excited to share today. I should say, outside of all this, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, where I study ocean physics, involves research that's very different, but similarly data-driven.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Angie Schmidt. Actually, a little correction to my bio. I don't work at Streets Blog anymore, but for a long time, I was writing about transportation issues day in and day out at a publication called Streets Blog that had kind of a national focus. And then a few years ago, I wrote a book about pedestrian safety. I sort of wrote the book on pedestrian safety or pedestrian deaths really in the United States, because as far as I know, no one had ever written a book about that topic before in the US. In my book, I did talk a little bit about jaywalking enforcement, how it's often linked to police brutality, or a lot of injustice around fines and fees that can really spiral for low-income people. And I made the point in the book that I just didn't think it really had much impact on safety at all. And in fact, pedestrian safety outcomes have gotten a lot worse over the past decade or so. That was the focus of my book. So a few years ago, I did write an article that was excerpted from the book for Bloomberg City Lab, calling for getting rid of jaywalking laws. And at the time, well, it was published sort of during the summer of 2020. And that was, a crazy time in our country with the pandemic and the protests that were happening. But I think when the book was published, it was a very radical idea, but those protests opened up a lot of space for more radical rethinking of some of our policing. And obviously there's been a lot of progress on it over the last few years. I've only been tangentially involved. I have a consulting firm now, and occasionally, like I did testify on behalf of the California legislation. There are concerns. Usually one of the main concerns is about safety. So I've just been a person that sort of gets called in to sometimes de-escalate that concern.
Thank you, Angie. We'll be turning to you in just a moment to answer a little bit more about the history. More than a century ago, Spokane, Washington passed an anti-jaywalking law in 1918 that made crossing the street outside a designated crosswalk a punishable offense. So Angie, can you talk a little bit more about the origins of jaywalking laws and how what happened in Spokane became a part of a broader national trend?
Yeah, there's some history that was sort of forgotten that was dug up by a historian named Peter Norton at the University of Virginia that I talk about in my book, and that has been covered a little bit by some media outlets around the country for years now. He talks about this early auto era in the United States and how there was actually a lot of resistance in cities to sort of what happened was overnight, cars came into cities in a big way, and there started being a high number of deaths to the invention of the Model T Ford. So prior to the auto era, people were just walking around cities, using streets. Children were using streets as places to play. Merchants were selling goods out of carts in the streets. Streets were public places. And in an effort to deflect blame for the mounting death toll around the 1910s, 1920s, a group of auto-oriented interests, including motoring enthusiast clubs, auto dealers, gas sellers, they got together and they introduced this concept of jaywalking. And it really transformed the way we think about who has a right to the streets, who has a right to public space, because streets take up such a huge portion of public space in our cities, sometimes 20, 30%. So obviously that was very influential and effective. I think it was Herbert Hoover that even before he was elected president, when he was part of like the cabinet, he made that part of federal policy. And now, you know, it's such a big part of the way we conceptualize this issue that there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction. And this was kind of the point of the introduction of this idea that if someone is killed while they're walking, then the sort of rebuttal is, well, what were they doing in the street anyway? And I think it's become sort of, that framing has become a big obstacle to looking at some of the bigger structural causes of the increase we've seen in pedestrian deaths.
Thank you so much. Ethan, based on your research, how have you seen jaywalking and related laws that govern pedestrian movement show up in local and state laws?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. So Washington is really interesting in that it has a real smorgasbord of jaywalking laws. So at the state level, there are a number of RCWs under 4661 that address basically 4 broad categories of jaywalking. And those are crossing outside of sidewalks, which can mean either crossing mid-block or diagonally at an intersection. It's crossing against a signal at an intersection. There's walking on the roadway if sidewalks exist, or if there aren't sidewalks, walking on the wrong side, so on the shoulder with traffic as opposed to against traffic. And then the 4th one is suddenly entering the roadway into the path of a vehicle. And all 4 of those violations are civil non-traffic infractions, a $68 ticket, not including court fees or late penalties. And so for some context, the Free to Walk bill, Senate Bill 5383, would get rid of the first 2 of those 4 violations, allowing pedestrians to cross mid-block or at an intersection when it's safe to do so. And it would also remove the requirement that you have to walk against traffic when sidewalks aren't provided, tackling that 3rd one. And in Washington, I found that the first category, that those mid-block crossings, they lead to about half of all jaywalking stops by police. The bill would still prohibit walking into the street without exercising due care, similar to the decriminalization in California. But what due care means is a little subject to interpretation, and you would be right if you see that as sort of a loophole. In the police reports that I've reviewed, lack of due care is mentioned in about 1/3 of jaywalking stops, in the form of an officer noting that someone crossed the street and forced a driver to use their brakes to slow down or come to a stop. So what we're looking at is a bill that would get rid of about probably 2/3 of police contacts related to jaywalking. And those are the RCWs. Most cities cite to them, but there are a few including Seattle, Yakima, and Auburn that still have local laws that mirror those RCWs. The bill would preempt those local laws. And then there's another layer that I know Anwar will get to, which is that most cities in Washington have these so-called pedestrian interference statutes. And that's a criminal violation. It's often $250 or $500. And those are given out for, in quotes, intentionally disrupting the flow of traffic. And clearly here, intention is another very gray area. And I think I should maybe mention my research. I should give some background on what I've done. It's involved filing dozens of public records requests to police departments and dispatch agencies around the state. And the results that I'm going to share today are preliminary, but they're based on thousands of records of jaywalking stops from more than half of the counties in Washington over the past 6 years. And I've had a particular focus on Pierce and King counties and the cities of Spokane and Kennewick. And altogether, those regions represent about half of the state's population. And I took a bit different approach from just looking at tickets that have been issued. So I wanted to zoom out and look at all police contexts that stem from jaywalking, and not only read and analyze the sometimes like very detailed police narratives that get reported with maybe some of the more interesting incidents, but also think about the more mundane interactions that come out of when an officer just stops someone and gives them a warning. And those are often recorded by dispatch agencies, but not the police. And when you zoom out, what I found is that somewhere between 60 to 80% of all of these contacts result in just a warning. Something around 10 to 30% lead to a ticket, citation. And then the remaining 6% or so might actually result in an arrest. And I'll share more about what I've seen across the state, but that's probably a good place to pause.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Anwar, could you tell us what you've observed about how jaywalking is treated in Spokane today?
Well, it's interesting. About a century after the original jaywalking laws were passed here in Spokane, Spokane was dealing with another matter concerning what it was called the sit and lie law, where it was specifically targeting homeless folks sitting and lying on the streets. And so that law was repealed for a short time. And it was interesting that during that time that it was repealed, public defenders saw a dramatic increase in jaywalking arrests as a result. In fact, we've kind of mapped it out here in Spokane, and it seems like all the jaywalking arrests happen in known homeless locations, and none happen in South Hill, which South Hill is our more affluent areas of our community. And so specifically what I've observed here in Spokane is that jaywalking or pedestrian interference laws have been used to target homeless folks as well as Black and brown folks. Last February, I was contacted by a treatment facility where they observed a Black homeless individual who was their client get tackled by 5 Spokane police officers in front of their doors because he had jaywalked. And when you looked at the body camera footage, what had actually happened was this individual had videotaped these officers harassing other homeless folks. When the officers told him to leave, he did leave. About a half block down the street, he crosses the street and you can hear the officers on the body camera, "Hey, let's go get him. Pedestrian interference, let's get him." And so these officers took off in a sprint, going a half block, chased this individual, slammed him down on the concrete, tased him multiple times, then charged him with pedestrian interference, but then stacked charges on top of it. Assault of an officer, resisting, obstruction. And he spent about 12 weeks in jail. And finally, when the prosecutor looked at the body camera footage and matched up the police reports, they gave this gentleman a deal, plead guilty for pedestrian interference, and we'll let the most severe charges go. Mainly because when in the police reports, when it indicate the individual tried to attack the officers with nunchucks, that never happened. And so the only probable cause that these officers had to deal with this individual was pedestrian interference. And here this individual was already dealing with a lot of mental trauma, who he was trying to get help for because he was going to this treatment center. And now he's dealing with severe more trauma. And so that's what I've observed in Spokane about how jaywalking laws are effectuated here.
Thank you so much, Anwar. I think this question is for others who may want to chime in. How is jaywalking enforced both here in Washington and across the country? And what can happen if someone is stopped for jaywalking? And who is most impacted by this enforcement?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think the first thing that I would want to share is where these stops tend to occur. So for every stop that I looked at where there was some clearly defined location, an address or cross street or landmark, I looked at the street environment using satellite imagery. And the takeaway that I would share with you is that these stops in Washington, by and large, happen on very, very large arterials. 3/4 of crossing related violations that led to a stop happen on roads that are 5 or more lanes. Most instances of mid-block crossings that led to a stop, they've happened 500 or more feet from the nearest marked crosswalk or signalized intersection, which is at least a 2-minute detour on foot. And that's not including the wait for sometimes very long signals that usually prioritize vehicles, not people walking. And most violations related to walking on the roadway, they've occurred on roads that have no sidewalks or sidewalk only on one side. So these are people who are making rational and inevitable decisions when they're confronted with really deeply pedestrian hostile street infrastructure. And this shows up in examples of stops. There's someone who made it halfway across a wide street before the sign changed. So she stopped in the concrete median and then was contacted by an officer. There's multiple instances that I've seen of intersections with crosswalks on only 3 of the 4 sides, and someone crosses on the 4th because they don't want to go the long way around and they get stopped. And there's also pretty unambiguous examples that I've seen of officers incorrectly stopping people who are lawfully crossing using an unmarked crosswalk, which in Washington are at every intersection except those between 2 signals. And it seems that officers just aren't aware of that, or they're taking advantage of the fact that much of the public probably isn't aware of that. And so that's the street setting. Who's impacted most by this enforcement? It's exactly what Anwar shared. So at least half of everyone impacted all over Washington state, not just Spokane, by jaywalking stops. That would be 44% as a preliminary number, are homeless. And that is almost certainly an underestimate. That's a statistic that I determined mostly based on the home address listed in police reports, nearly half of which were either noted as transient or homeless, or were the address of a shelter or homeless service provider. And I also used clues like an officer writing that they offer someone a housing voucher. And I realized that that statistic may be challenging for hopefully not for folks who are on this call, but for some people in this environment today when there's a lot of animosity towards folks who are unhoused. But this is the reality, that people who are most exposed to the street environment are going to be those who are most criminalized by that exposure, not to mention the animosity that comes from police. And last but not least, we know that in Seattle, at least, those cited for jaywalking are disproportionately Black. That's from a 2017 article. I can tentatively say that the same appears to be true across the state. Shouldn't be a surprise based on everything we know from lived experience and Angie's book and other research and writing. I'm still working on that part of the analysis. It will come out in a report with TCC that will have all of this research. So I just say stay tuned for more there.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And Anwar, excuse me, and Angie, feel free to add on to what Ethan just said, but also the next question just is talking about how jaywalking laws are used as a tool of oppression. So somebody would like to start to address that.
So I'll just add to what Ethan said. I'm not aware of every instance I'm aware of where they've looked at who's being stopped for jaywalking. It's always been disproportionately people of color, and younger Black men in particular are frequently targeted. I think it's the nature of this offense. It's such a minor offense. Police have broad discretion over whether they're going to enforce it or not. And so it just lends itself to biased enforcement. So we've seen that everywhere. There's an example in Seattle. Another thing that, to your next question, I think a lot of people, these stops can sometimes be pretty explosive, is one thing I say in my book, because people feel rightly, I think rightly, sort of outraged to be stopped for such a trivial offense, right? And a lot of times people are confused too. Why am I being stopped? What did I do wrong? They're not expecting to have to interact with police for something like this. So they can escalate really quickly. So someone who feels targeted, feels that they're executed, maybe they say something back that strikes a police officer as disrespectful, and then all of a sudden, it can really escalate into something that's pretty negative. And there's an example, actually, I cited in my book from Seattle, where this is years ago, but there's an example where a stop involving, like, I think it was a 15-year-old girl, a teenage girl. She was a Black girl. She was struck. A police officer punched her in a jaywalking interaction. So there's other examples, like in New York, oftentimes it's actually very embarrassing for, like, I think, if you're a public official, you have concerns about this. There's really a self-interest argument for getting rid of these laws for you too, because you don't want to see your police officers in the news. They've beat someone up and the charge is jaywalking. That's embarrassing for the municipality. Nobody thinks that's a good use of, or a rational response, or really a good use of police resources. So there's examples of that too, all over the country, where there's a very embarrassing example in New York City where an elderly Asian man ends up, bloodied, and he's in the front page of the New York Post because he stopped for jaywalking. He doesn't speak English, doesn't understand what's going on, and it escalated that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll speak on this aspect of jaywalking's laws being used as a tool of oppression. I gave the example earlier of the Black homeless gentleman. I too have been stopped for jaywalking here in Spokane. That incident was very interesting because I had actually crossed next to a crosswalk. But what set the officer off was when he drove by me initially. He heard me as I raised my hands and chanted, "George Floyd didn't deserve to die." This was the same week that Derek Chauvin was convicted. And it's indicated in the police reports that because of that statement, I had an anti-police view. And because of that, that turned into this jaywalking incident where the police chief had to intercede to have my charges dropped, because once they looked at the body camera and the police reports, it indicated that things were fabricated. But it's this aspect here, at least here in Spokane, that not only are they targeting homeless and Black and brown folks, but they're also targeting activists that speak up for those said groups. Quite a few of us activists actually out here have been arrested for pedestrian interference. And what's more interesting is with my case with jaywalking, I had a mediation meeting with the officer, and that was set up by the ombudsman office here, who takes police complaints and whatnot. And so it's curious, probably about a month or so ago, I went out to dinner with this police ombudsman, and we were leaving a Spokane downtown restaurant, and we saw this white individual cross the street on his cell phone, almost get hit by a cop, right? Almost get hit by the cop. This white guy keeps walking by and whatnot. And both me and the ombudsman were just like, wow, did that really happen? Well, as it turns out, that white person that crossed the street was a Spokane City Council person. Now, imagine if it was a different person that didn't have the fancy clothes on, that was bringing two bags across the street while that officer was trying to cross the street. Do you think that that officer would have stopped at that point? But because the city council person looked at a certain part, he wasn't stopped, questioned, detained, searched. And let's talk about it. When these jaywalking stops happen, the aspect, the situation that actually takes place is they are allowed to search you. And depending on what you have on you, you could go to jail for that. And so it's not the aspect of, oh yeah, I crossed the street, my bad, whatnot, sorry, officer. It's like, nope, now that you've committed a crime, I have the right to search you, drop your pockets, whatever you've got inside now is an arrestable offense. So these things could snowball, and they only typically snowball for people that look like this, have bags. We've got to repeal this law. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwar. Ethan, is there anything you wanted to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, and what Angie and Edward shared really sets this up. It's amazing how when you look at the local, it mirrors the the regional and the national, and it really is all entirely unsurprising. So what I've seen across Washington is indeed that police are using jaywalking stops, not mainly for safety education, as they might say they're doing, but rather as an opportunity to arbitrarily stop people who are walking in low income or high crime areas, and to check for warrants, and perhaps conduct a search to look for drugs, to ask questions. And the evidence for this is that in the dispatch reports I've reviewed, I see police conducting warrant checks during about 80% of those jaywalking stops. In other words, taking advantage of this opportunity to run people's names and birth dates and IDs through national and state criminal databases. And not only that, but in the narrative reports, these stops are commonly happening as part of so-called street crimes or predictive policing emphasis patrols. They're being bundled in with these patrols for crimes that are really unrelated. And I think it would not be inaccurate to say that this is what's happening is by and large a stop and frisk style approach to policing. And despite the fact that this ensnares so many people into this dragnet, only a small fraction of all of those warrant checks actually end up finding an open warrant, which in this country is worth noting are largely for crimes of poverty, things like unpaid fines, missed court appearances. And then only a fraction of those open warrants actually result in arrest. So it's an ineffective policing strategy that, from a pretty objective statistical sense, just wastes resources and ends up harassing those who are unlucky enough to be walking in these areas. And those are the numbers, but I think it's also worth highlighting, as Anwar has pointed out, the danger and Angie, that the danger that these stops create. And these really are instances that can become explosive very easily. There's one example that I saw. A black 27-year-old man was jaywalking, and an officer noticed and was, I think, sitting at a gas station and sort of shouted over, hey, what you did there was jaywalking, and it would be nice if you cross the street were legally authorized in the future, from a distance. And the man walks away, probably because he wasn't clear that he was being detained, or maybe he's scared of the police for good reason. And he ends up getting tackled and wrestled to the ground. The officer tries to handcuff him, but he resists. And the officer places his left arm around that person's neck and holds it there, and he goes unconscious. And that's, just one incident. There are a lot that I've read that were pretty hard to read, I would say. And it's not difficult to see how these stops that are just so unnecessary from a safety perspective create the circumstances for police violence, right? For George Floyd, for Tyre Nichols. And that's something that could happen right here in Seattle and Spokane and Puyallup and Kennewick, and it does happen. And that's, zooming out here, it's just why it's so important that we get rid of these laws to prevent these sorts of unnecessary police contexts that, for reasons that are really understandable, can become dangerous for everyone involved.
Thank you. I think that highlights that, the common concern we see against repealing jaywalking laws is that it'll make our streets less safe. We certainly don't believe that's going to be the case. Can each of you speak to this misconception, and what do you see as the true future of safe streets?
Sure, I'll hop in because I was actually just this afternoon doing some research. I've been working on this a little bit with America Walks. So I was just updating, we're watching really closely what happened in Virginia, what's been happening around traffic injuries and fatalities in Virginia, because Virginia was the first state to decriminalize jaywalking, and it happened in March 2021. So as of yet, there hasn't been like a rigorous academic study that controls for a lot of variables. It's still pretty new, but looking at the data, it's not apparent there's been any difference. And I think actually it's not surprising, probably most people realize the statute has changed. So other thing is we're not getting under the current, another point out just real quickly, under the current paradigm, we're not getting good safety outcomes. Pedestrian deaths are up 100% over the last decade. Where I live in Ohio, they're up about 62% nationally over just a decade. So what we're doing right now really isn't working very well.
Yeah, that's, oh, I don't go for it.
So, what I would say about, whether or not this would make it less safe on our streets or not, I would say this: whose streets? These are our streets. And right now, what's happening is our streets aren't safe with this law in place. My fellow friends that are homeless, that live on those streets, do not feel that these streets are safe, mainly because police are utilizing these laws to harass homeless. And this creates a culture inside the homeless community that believes that police aren't their friends. And unfortunately, the statistics play out that homeless folks are have a higher likelihood to be victims of crimes and need police services. And unfortunately, having these kind of laws in place allows police to harass these folks, and so they don't feel comfortable reporting crimes or trying to connect with services. So, I would also suggest that I don't believe repealing this law, all of us are going to rush out in mass and go jaywalking in mass and on the freeway. I think rational folks know how to cross the street without getting harmed. Ask anybody that lives in the suburbs and borrows their neighbor's lawnmower. Do they go to a crosswalk then? No. Do they get harmed bringing that lawnmower across the street? No. Then what's the difference? Well, the difference is that we've got a law that specifically targets folks and creates an atmosphere where a person with a gun has to tell you how not to be unsafe. How about we come to a point where we all admit what we need to do is safe or not, and maybe the people that need to be enforcing, communicating that crossing the street in a certain way isn't correct, shouldn't be those that have the power to kill. We can track all of this back to these kind of misdemeanor crimes that have unfortunately led to a rash now in our country of Black and brown folks dying. And so anything that we can do to create a culture of less proactive policing and more proactive community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Ethan?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I agree with all those points. if for people who think that the sky is going to fall if we repeal these laws, it's simple. It's not. It's we know that from evidence. We know that from just, I think, our gut understanding of why people jaywalk. There's a statistic that I really love from Angie's book that in the UK, where jaywalking laws don't exist, despite, I would say, pretty similarly car-centric infrastructure, their per capita rate of pedestrian fatalities is about half of ours. And same goes for a lot of other countries with better records of pedestrian safety than ours. We just don't need jaywalking laws to keep people safe. And it took a little while to survey the scientific literature, and what I found was similar to what Angie said. I couldn't find any research studies that support the importance of jaywalking laws for pedestrian safety on a population level. It's it is a really methodologically challenging question to answer, but there's the fact is it's not an evidence-based policy. It's always been more of a cultural thing. What we know is the solution for pedestrian safety, to speak to that question, is not criminalizing jaywalking. It's things like speed reduction, narrower streets, speed cushions, speed bumps, curb extensions that reduce the crossing distance for people on wide streets, raise pedestrian crossings that make people more visible and make crossings more visible, refuge islands, flashing beacons. All of these things are superior strategies to jaywalking enforcement. And it's not, a simple thing. We know that just painting new crosswalks alone doesn't create safety for people. There are two studies that were also mentioned in Angie's book that found that drivers yield to pedestrians less than 20% of the time in these simple non-controlled, just painted crosswalks. So you can't just paint a crosswalk and expect people to be safe. You really have to change the whole street design. But that's what we have to do. And to those who say, we repeal these laws, it's going to send a message, people's behaviors will change. I just came off of a successful almost 2-year effort to repeal King County's bike helmet law, which, like jaywalking laws, was unforced fairly against people of color and those living unhoused. And there was also research, actually a lot of it, for helmet laws that showed a present day lack of efficacy for those laws as a strategy for injury prevention. And King County, the Public Health Seattle King County, has been working on a study looking at, based on observations, looking at helmet usage across King County after the repeal happened. And preliminary findings from that have shown no change in average helmet use. Is still 91% across the county for people riding personal bikes, as compared to 91% from a similar study in 2018. So the sky has not fallen, and we won't see a free-for-all in the streets. People will continue jaywalking just as they do today under the threat of enforcement. For some people, not all. And a lot of those street crossings will be people making safe, rational decisions, looking for traffic the way that we all have to do, even when we cross at intersections when drivers can turn left or right into you. The only difference after the repeal will be that people be harassed a little less on these sort of arbitrary bases, people just trying to get around.
Well, yes, and as you're mentioning, I mean, if somebody is endangering people, they're running across multiple lanes of traffic, causing havoc. This does not prevent them from being arrested in those cases, where it would potentially be appropriate. So thank you. Now we're going to take some questions from the audience. Thanks so much for submitting such thoughtful questions. We've received more questions than we have time to address, but we're going to share all the questions with the event speakers so they can know what issues are priorities for community members. The first question we're going to dive into, and I'll leave it up to whomever it feels like is the appropriate person to answer. How does repealing change liability for damages when collisions occur? And the same question is for decriminalization.
I actually don't know the answer, but for sure. But I would expect that it would change liability a little bit. Oftentimes, if someone is killed when they're walking, or if they're injured, it's really suppressing, but a lot of times people, even people who are hospitalized, police show up in their hospital room and cite them for jaywalking. And there's like no concern about what the conditions are on the road. So, and I think it's a really good question. I wish I had a better handle on it. But I do think it's a lot of this is sort of about power, right? It's like, if you're a pedestrian, you're not supposed to ever, you're lower on the hierarchy. You're never supposed to delay someone in a car. That's sort of part of what's going on with these kind of laws. So I think that that's one positive thing that comes out of repealing them is pedestrians need a little more power in these kind of interactions. They're already going to be killed, right? Like there's a real physical imbalance, right? So pedestrians bear much more risk in interactions with cars. And then to have the legal authorities sort of piling on with a lot of unjust, in my opinion, additional force is negative. It's not helping us sort of balance out the power imbalance that's inherent in these kind of interactions. But I wish I had a better answer towards the legal question.
Yeah, it sounds
Yeah,
like
I
this
can-
is something we can do some more research on. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree. I'm also not an attorney, and I think what I would guess though is that it would weight things in speaking of the power imbalance more towards people walking, and I do see. So in the police reports that I got, a lot of them were post-collision reports of someone who was jaywalking and got hit by a driver. And there are instances that I see of like someone was hit in a 6-lane road, and 2 lanes of traffic were stopped for the person to cross, and then the person popped out from behind those cars, and the driver was in the 3rd lane and really should have stopped, because if you see 2 lanes of traffic stopped, you probably guess there's someone crossing, and they hit the person who was jaywalking, and then that person who got hit was automatically assigned fault because they were jaywalking. And that's, I think, a situation that I would hope at least would be the outcome there would be a little different. And to what Angie said about people being cited in the hospital, I've seen instances of that too. It's really that does happen, and it's pretty horrifying. There was even, gosh, it was one report that I read was a fatality collision, someone who was killed while jaywalking, and the last line in the police report was, had the victim survived his injuries, he could have potentially been issued a citation for jaywalking. And just reading that is gut-wrenching. I think this goes to the cultural shift that needs to change in this country about who has power on the streets.
Thank you so much. What is really at stake if we don't repeal these laws? Some people may feel this is a small issue when we're dealing with so many larger issues. So how can people respond to that query? I guess I would partly say, I think what we've seen with Tyree Nichols is that, just even infractions can lead to bad police outcomes, and that it really isn't always a small issue. It is about overall how we make our communities safer, and the questions of which communities are we talking about, and whose life may be valued over others, and the whole power issue we're talking about as well.
And I'd just like to piggyback off of that. There was a wonderful documentary that was made not too long ago that was specifically talking about the misdemeanor element to law enforcement and how deadly it is. I can't think of the documentary off the top of my head right now, but it was really impactful because it really talked about how many of these kind of low-level offenses spiral out of control. And so, anything that we can do on trying to resolve that kind of issue and stopping that kind of possible contact to take place, it is beneficial for all of our community. Because, I know we're focusing a lot on the law enforcement element of the transportation thing, but it is so relevant because all of us are guilty of jaywalking at one point, no matter our cultural status or whatnot. And so this element affects us all, and anything that we can do to kind of resolve issues relating to this and think of better ways of how we can deal with our transportation needs. I will say this, it just so happens the stretch of road that I was arrested on for jaywalking happens to be a multi-million-dollar improvement road that our city did, where we've got tons of sidewalk or crosswalks all over this street. They narrowed down the street to decrease the speed and created a more pedestrian-friendly environment. We need to be talking about how we can change, like it was talked about earlier, the power dynamic of these public spaces that we call streets and create a more inviting element for pedestrians to use them instead of this tiny little strip of crosswalk that we as pedestrians get the right to use, but these cars get this whole swath of stretch. We need to start re-envisioning how we plan our cities out, as well as transportation issues relevant to it. So that deals with how our bus systems interact with our communities, as well as how our transit officers are interacting with our homeless folks that are using these transportation systems. All of these things we need to address, and it's in hopes that we do some kind of change, as why we are pushing for these repeals of this law. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anwar. The next question is basically saying, how can we highlight the decision makers locally and in the legislature to boost political will to end jaywalking laws, and what action is really needed to end this law?
I can step in. I would love if anyone from TCC is able to speak to this too, but I would say just join the movement to repeal these laws here in Washington. It's a first step. The coalition website is freetowalkwa.org. Right now we have the Senate bill. There's a companion House bill. I think we have momentum. I'm optimistic, and there are small actions you can take as well as larger ones. For instance, you can sign in pro on the state legislature website, which indicates your support for repealing these laws. You can also send in a written comment, and you can also give verbal testimony. And since Olympia is in a hybrid session this year, you can do that on Zoom, as well as go straight to Olympia if you want to be there in person. If you do plan on giving verbal testimony, you can, I think you can register up until an hour or 3 hours or something before the hearing. Hoping this will get a hearing soon. And yeah, I would just encourage you to join the email list and watch for updates about how you can get involved in this. I would, yeah, actually, this whole week is our week of advocacy that TCC is doing, and there are a bunch of opportunities this week. There's a Twitter Power Hour. There's a letter writing session that you can sign up for, and hopefully you've seen the opportunities to do so. And we can put more info in the chat there.
Thanks, Ethan. Here's another question. We have long stretches of road with no crosswalks. Are there any proposed or enacted laws here in Washington or around the country which define a minimum distance between crosswalks for arterials? And what other kinds of laws could we pass to improve the situation?
I know that Portland has some internal rules about that. So it's not a law, but they have policies. and they're broken down by land use. So they do have rules about how frequent crosswalks are, but that's the only one I'm aware of. So a lot of times there just aren't any crosswalks, although there may be unmarked crosswalks, which people don't realize are a thing. So.
Anyone else have any on the panel have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
The next question is whether the speakers have any thoughts on how this approach that expands the potential for people to cross anywhere might interact with the legal obligation of jurisdictions to provide ADA accessible crossings. Or how might repealing the jaywalking laws benefit or challenge people that use mobility services, and whether we have any data on this.
Yeah, I think you can absolutely imagine ways in which this will end up decriminalizing an action that someone who is in a wheelchair might be taking because they're being confronted with a lack of ADA accessible curb cuts, and instead they're crossing at a driveway, right? Somewhere else where it's easier for them to get across, or it's possible even for them to get across because it's not where there's no curb cut. The current laws already allow those who require it for mobility purposes to go on the street when there's a blockage in the sidewalk, but I think that those laws could be strengthened in ways that include things like construction impacts. Folks who even folks without mobility issues should be able to legally walk on the street when the sidewalk is blocked, when it's covered with snow, when the lighting is poor and they don't feel safe on that side of the street for any sort of reason. You can sort of start to imagine all the ways that freeing these things up could unlock a lot of or decriminalize a lot of really normal, safe, everyday behaviors that people of all different needs take.
Thanks a lot. We're getting towards the end of our time here together. The one final question has to do with cost and savings that might be associated with repealing jaywalking laws. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is that, obviously, if the police can be focusing on other more dangerous things, I would say right now they have a hard time. We are understaffed with our police and such. It seems like it helps to support deploying them in trying to deal with major crimes and other things like that. The court system, even with infractions, people end up having to go through the court system, which costs money. I don't know if there's anything else that anybody else might want to bring up.
Yeah, I would add it could potentially save a lot of money in settlements, right? Where I live in Cleveland, it's crazy what we pay in police settlements. So, a single stop could escalate and become very, very, very costly for a locality. And then there's the savings to individuals with the fines. And the fines, if it's poor people being fined, oftentimes they can't pay them. They end up in this cycle of where maybe their license is suspended, or they're serving time in jail, losing a job. So there's all kinds of affiliated harms that come from that.
Thank you so much. Well, we'd like to thank all of you for attending today's transit talk on repealing Washington's jaywalking laws, and a real huge thank you to our panel. If you're interested in getting involved with this work, please check out the Free to Walk Washington campaign that's linked in the chat. You can sign up to take action, stay informed, or join the coalition. And if you have further questions about the legislative session, you can email Matthew Sutherland from Transportation Choices, and his email is in the chat. And then, as a final reminder, that this event is a part of Transportation Choices Week of Action, and there are more events this week. So please check out the remaining programming through the link in the chat. And we'd like to thank you all so much for joining, and thanks once again to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.